Have you ever woken up feeling overwhelmed by a storm inside, a rush of emotions so intense it feels like they're running the show? Maybe fear's gripping your heart, or doubt is whispering lies, or anger flares up unexpectedly. And in that moment, it's easy to believe those feelings have all the power, like they're the boss of your life. But what if I told you that your emotions, though real and powerful, were never meant to be in charge? What if the feelings that seem so loud, so urgent, are actually visitors, not rulers? Imagine what would happen if you could honor what you feel without letting it dictate your every move. What if you could feel fear and still move forward, feel pain and still find peace, feel doubt and still stand strong? Today, we're going to unpack how to recognize your emotions as real, but not the ones calling the shots. What you feel is valid, but it's not always the full truth. That's not a contradiction. That's a revelation. Because for too long, we've been taught to either suppress our emotions or be controlled by them, like it's one or the other. But emotions were never meant to be ignored, and they were never meant to be obeyed without question either. They're like the check engine light on your dashboard. They tell you something is going on under the hood, but they don't tell you exactly what the problem is. That's where discernment comes in. That's where spiritual maturity starts to grow. Not in denying what you feel, but in learning how to investigate it. When you feel anger rise up, that's real. That's not something to shame yourself for. When you feel sadness that you can't explain, or anxiety that doesn't make logical sense, it doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human. It means something in your internal world is asking for attention. But just because a feeling shows up with passion and volume doesn't mean it's telling you the whole story. Sometimes your emotions are reacting not just to the present moment, but to past wounds that never got processed. Sometimes you're not just angry, you're grieving. Sometimes you're not just scared, you're remembering. And if you don't take a step back to ask where that emotion is coming from, you might end up making permanent decisions from temporary disruptions. This is why you have to learn to respect your emotions without recruiting them to lead your life. They have something to say, but they're not always speaking truth. They're speaking experience. And sometimes your experience has been filtered through fear, insecurity, rejection, or trauma. So when you say, I feel like nobody cares, that's a real feeling, but it's not a fact. When you say, I feel like I'm never going to change, that's how it feels in the moment, but that's not the whole story. Feelings don't always come with full context. They scream about the pain, but they whisper about the possibility. And if you only listen to the scream, you'll miss the signal. You'll miss the opportunity to grow because you let your emotion become your identity. Your mind can host a storm without letting it become your forecast. Just because chaos is happening inside you doesn't mean it has to define what's coming next. You can acknowledge what's going on emotionally without agreeing with it as your reality. There are moments when your thoughts are loud, your heart is heavy, and your perspective is clouded. But that doesn't mean you have to live like the storm is permanent. You might be carrying anxiety, fear, insecurity, or doubt, but just because it's raining in your soul doesn't mean it's raining in your future. We get into trouble when we assume that what's happening in us is a reflection of what's going to happen to us. The storm may be raging inside, but God's plan hasn't changed. The enemy would love for you to believe that because you feel broken today, you'll always be broken. That because you're in a valley now, the mountain must have disappeared. But the presence of emotional turmoil doesn't cancel the promises over your life. You can feel overwhelmed and still be in the center of what God is doing. You can feel like giving up and still be one decision away from a breakthrough. That's why you have to learn to differentiate between what your emotions are saying and what truth is declaring. The storm isn't the problem. It's how you interpret it. Some storms aren't here to destroy you. They're here to reveal what your foundation is built on. They show you what needs healing. They show you where your peace is anchored. And sometimes the reason your emotions are so loud is because something deeper is surfacing, something that needs to be surrendered, not silenced. You can't stop every emotional storm from showing up, but you can stop it from deciding the course of your day. You can feel the wind of fear, but you don't have to bow to it. You can hear the thunder of doubt, but you don't have to let it shake your decisions. You can be surrounded by waves and still stand still on the inside. That's the power of knowing who you are and who is with you in the storm. It's not about pretending the clouds don't exist. It's about refusing to let them write your story. Faith isn't the absence of emotion, it's the authority over it. If you're waiting to feel fearless before you move, you'll be stuck in the same spot for the rest of your life. Emotions aren't evil, they're just not designed to lead. Faith doesn't cancel out what you feel, it puts it in proper perspective. You can be full of faith and still feel frustrated. You can trust God and still wrestle with tension in your soul. That doesn't make you fake, that makes you human. Faith doesn't silence your emotions, it just refuses to be silenced by them. Some of us have been trying to manufacture a version of faith that feels clean and calm and easy, but real faith is often forged in emotional mess. It's forged when your heart is breaking, but your hands are still raised. It's forged when your mind is racing, but you choose to pray anyway. It's forged when fear is screaming in your ear and you decide to take a step forward. That's where faith gets real, when it meets the raw, unfiltered emotions of life and still stands its ground. Faith is not the absence of tears. It's the courage to keep walking through them. There's a lie we've believed that says if you were really spiritual, you wouldn't feel this way. But Jesus himself wept. He felt anguish. He got tired. He had moments where his soul was deeply troubled, and yet he never let emotion override his mission. That's the balance. Feeling what's real, but not letting it take you off course. You don't need to get rid of emotion to walk in authority. You just need to stop giving emotion more authority than it was ever meant to have. You were created with both spirit and soul. Your soul may scream, but your spirit speaks. And you get to decide which voice has the final word. Faith steps in when emotion tries to take over and says, you're seen, but you're not sovereign. You don't have to pretend not to feel. You just need to remember who you are even when you feel it. Feelings fluctuate, but faith stands. Feelings can change in an hour, but faith anchors you to something eternal. That's what keeps you steady when everything around you is shaking. You can feel fear and still walk forward. Fear is not proof that you're failing. It's often the sign that you're standing at the edge of something important. The presence of fear doesn't disqualify you from stepping into your purpose. In fact, some of the greatest acts of obedience happen when fear is loud, but faith is louder. Too many people wait for fear to disappear before they act, not realizing that movement is what causes fear to lose its grip. Fear grows in silence, but it shrinks in motion. Every step you take while afraid is a declaration that fear doesn't get the final say. Fear has a voice, and it often shows up dressed in logic. It says, what if you fail? What if they reject you? What if it doesn't work? And those questions echo so loud that they start to sound like wisdom. But wisdom and fear are not the same thing. Wisdom considers the risk, but fear exaggerates it. Wisdom helps you prepare, but fear paralyzes you from even starting. Fear always wants to make your next step look bigger than it really is, so you'll back away and settle for safety over calling. But safety is not the same as peace, and comfort is not the same as growth. The enemy doesn't have to destroy you if he can just convince you to stay still. If he can keep you walking in circles because you're waiting to feel brave, then you'll never take the step that opens the next door. Courage isn't something you wait for, it's something you carry. It's not the absence of fear, it's the will to move anyway. Sometimes courage sounds like a whisper, not a war cry. Sometimes it looks like sending the email, making the phone call, showing up when everything in you wants to disappear. It looks like saying yes to the unknown when you're tempted to hide in what's familiar. There's a deeper strength that rises when you realize fear may walk with you, but it doesn't get to speak for you. You can acknowledge it without surrendering to it. You can walk through the valley with your head held high because fear doesn't control your feet. Your steps are ordered not by how you feel, but by who you follow. Your feelings need a seat, but not the steering wheel. Emotions are part of your journey, but they're not designed to drive it. They can inform you, but they shouldn't lead you. When you let your feelings lead, you end up reacting instead of responding. You make decisions based on the heat of the moment instead of the wisdom of the Spirit. And while your feelings are real, they aren't always right. They're valid, but they're not always accurate. Just because something feels urgent doesn't mean it's aligned with purpose. Just because something feels good in the moment doesn't mean it's wise in the long run. God gave you emotions as part of your humanity, not as your compass. When emotions are in the driver's seat, your life starts swerving in every direction. You're up one day, down the next. You're all in one week, burned out the next. You chase what gives you relief instead of what builds your future. But when you learn to give emotion its proper place, acknowledging it, processing it, learning from it without bowing to it, that's when emotional maturity begins to form. That's when you stop living reactionary and start living rooted. There are going to be days where you feel like quitting, where everything in you wants to shut down or lash out or walk away. And in those moments, you have to remember that feelings are temporary passengers, not permanent drivers. They're loud sometimes, even persuasive, but they don't have access to the map. They don't know where you're going. They weren't in the room when God gave you your assignment. So they can't be trusted to determine your direction. You're not called to ignore your feelings, but you are called to lead them, to teach them what is true, to remind them who's in charge. That means sitting with your anger long enough to understand what's under it, but not long enough to let it speak for you. That means naming your fear, not feeding it. That means recognizing that just because you feel rejected doesn't mean you are. There's wisdom in learning to listen without letting the emotion dictate your response. There's power in letting your spirit have the final vote, not just your soul. Emotion can ride with you. It just can't drive anymore. Healing happens when you let God speak louder than your triggers, because you will be triggered. You will be reminded of past pain, old wounds, former failures, and familiar patterns that try to convince you nothing has changed. Triggers are real. They're not a sign that you're weak or faithless. They're signs that something under the surface still wants to be healed. But healing doesn't happen just by avoiding triggers. Healing happens when you confront what hurts and allow truth to speak into it. And truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks softly, steadily through the word, through worship, through moments of stillness where God reminds you that your past doesn't have to lead your future. When a trigger shows up, your nervous system remembers before your mind does. You feel your heart racing, your walls going up, your perspective narrowing. And that's exactly where God wants to meet you, not in the pretend version of your strength, but in the place where the wound first started. Because God doesn't just heal symptoms, He heals the source. He doesn't just calm the emotion, He rewrites the belief underneath it. Maybe the trigger isn't just about what they said. Maybe it's about the lie that took root when you were abandoned or overlooked or betrayed. And every time something pokes that pain, the lie tries to speak again. But you don't have to listen anymore. God's voice doesn't shame you for feeling. It anchors you in truth so the feeling doesn't take over. It reminds you that just because you've been broken doesn't mean you're still broken. Just because you've been rejected doesn't mean you're unworthy. Just because you've been triggered doesn't mean you're disqualified. What if your trigger is actually an invitation? An invitation to let God into that room you've kept locked. An invitation to unlearn the fear that's been shaping your response. That's what healing really is. It's not about never feeling it again. It's about responding differently when you do. When God speaks louder than your trigger, you start seeing situations for what they are, not just what they remind you of. You stop overreacting to people who weren't the ones who hurt you. You stop repeating cycles that used to feel inevitable. You stop shrinking back when the old fear starts whispering again. Because the voice of truth starts echoing louder than the voice of trauma,